The wedding was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I'd been looking forward to it for years, not in the way fathers dread giving their daughters away, but in the genuine, full-hearted way of a man who raised his child alone and wanted to see her finally, completely happy. I had my speech ready. I had my suit pressed. I had 43 years of memories sitting right behind my eyes, ready to spill over at the altar. What I didn't have was any idea that my son-in-law had been waiting 5 years to hand me an envelope. He gave it to me during the reception, right after the toasts. The band was playing something soft and slow, and my daughter was dancing with her maid of honor, laughing at something I couldn't hear. My son-in-law put his hand on my shoulder, leaned close, and said, "I need you to read this tonight, not tomorrow, tonight." Then he pressed a sealed envelope into my palm and walked back to the dance floor like nothing had happened. I stood there holding it for a long time before I slipped it into my jacket pocket. I want to tell this story right, because it deserves to be told right. So let me go back to the beginning. My wife and I married young. I was 24, she was 22, both of us working jobs that barely paid the bills in a small city in Ohio. She was beautiful and restless, and I was steady and maybe a little dull, but we fit together the way mismatched things sometimes do. We had our daughter within the first year. Then, when our daughter was 3 years old, my wife told me she wasn't happy and walked out the front door with a suitcase and an address I didn't recognize. She didn't fight for custody. That surprised me, and for a long time it hurt me on my daughter's behalf more than my own. She visited when she felt like it, Christmas sometimes, a birthday here and there, but raising our daughter fell to me entirely and without argument. I won't pretend I didn't struggle. I won't pretend there weren't nights I sat at the kitchen table after my daughter was in bed, looking at the bills and wondering how I was going to do it. But I did it. We did it. The two of us, in a small house in Columbus with a leaky roof and a backyard that turned to mud every spring. My daughter was everything. She was whip-smart, funny in the dry way that catches you off guard, and stubborn in the way that serves you well in life if you can point it in the right direction. She ran cross-country in high school, studied accounting at Ohio State, and landed a job at a mid-sized firm in Cincinnati before she was 25. I drove down to help her move into her apartment, and we ate terrible Thai food on the floor of her empty living room, and she looked at me with those serious eyes she's had since she was 4 years old and said, "You know you're my favorite person, right?" I told her that was convenient because she was mine too. She met her husband at a conference in Chicago. He was a software engineer from Virginia, quiet and thoughtful, the kind of man who remembers details and asks follow-up questions. I liked him immediately, which surprised me because I had assumed I would be difficult about any man she brought home. He drove out to Columbus to meet me properly about 3 months into the relationship, sat at my kitchen table, drank my coffee, and talked to me for 4 hours about everything and nothing. Before he left, he shook my hand and said, "I want you to know that I understand what you did for her. I don't take that lightly." I thought that was an unusual thing for a young man to say. I filed it away. They got engaged 2 years later. She called me from Cincinnati, and I could hear her crying before she even said hello. Good crying, the best kind. I sat in my armchair and listened to the whole story. The restaurant, the ring, the way he'd gotten down on one knee. And I cried a little too, though I would not have admitted it then. The wedding was planned for September in Cincinnati at a venue along the Ohio River. Small by modern standards, about 80 people, but exactly what my daughter wanted. I helped where I could. I wrote the check for my portion without blinking. I practiced my speech in the bathroom mirror for 3 weeks. The day itself was everything it should have been. My daughter came down the aisle in a dress that had belonged to her grandmother. My mother, altered to fit her, and I had to clench my jaw and stare at the ceiling for a solid 10 seconds to keep from losing it entirely. The ceremony was short and honest. The vows were theirs, written themselves, and they made the room go quiet in that particular way that means everyone in it is feeling something real. At the reception, I gave my speech. I talked about the Thai food on the floor of her apartment. I talked about the time she was 7 and she built an entire city out of cardboard boxes in the living room and refused to let me throw it away for 6 weeks. I talked about how proud I was and how her mother missing this didn't diminish it, only made it more fully ours. That got a complicated kind of applause. And then my son-in-law put the envelope in my pocket and walked away. I didn't open it that night. I told myself I was too tired, too emotional, too full of everything the day had been. But the truth is, I was afraid. The weight of it felt wrong. A man doesn't hand his father-in-law a sealed envelope on his wedding night with that kind of expression on his face if the contents are good news. I opened it the next morning at the hotel breakfast table, alone, while my daughter and her husband slept in. There were 2 documents inside. The first was a letter, handwritten, 3 pages long. The second was a DNA test result. I read the DNA result first because my brain went straight to the thing that made the least sense. The test compared my daughter's DNA to mine. The probability of paternity, 0%. I read it 3 times. I set it down, I picked it up, and read it again. The eggs were getting cold in front of me, and the hotel breakfast room was filling up with families, and I was sitting in the middle of all of it, holding a piece of paper that had just rearranged everything I thought I knew about my life. Then I read the letter. My son-in-law had written it over the course of 2 years. He explained that carefully, that he had started it, stopped it, rewritten it, almost thrown it away a dozen times. He had found out by accident. My daughter had needed genetic testing for a medical screening. Routine, nothing serious. And the results had flagged an anomaly that sent her to a specialist who ran a broader panel, and eventually, quietly, told her that her biological father was not the man listed on her birth certificate. She had told her husband before she told anyone else. They had decided together, and he was clear that it had been a true together, not him pushing and her agreeing, that she needed time before she could face me with it. That she was terrified. Not of me. He was careful to write, but of what it would mean. Of watching my face change. Of the possibility, however small, that knowing might make me love her differently. He had written the letter because he wanted me to have something I could hold and reread without her having to watch me absorb it in real time. He wanted me to have space to feel whatever I needed to feel before I had to look at her. He ended the letter with this. She is more afraid of losing you than she has ever been afraid of anything. Everything she is, you made. That doesn't change. I just need you to tell her that. I sat at that hotel breakfast table for a long time. I'm 63 years old. I have not had an easy life, but I have had a meaningful one, and part of what makes it meaningful is that I have learned, slowly, expensively, to sit with hard things before I react to them. So that's what I did. I sat with it. I ordered more coffee. I watched a family at the next table try to convince their toddler to eat a waffle, and I thought about my daughter at that age, the way she used to climb into my bed at 6 a.m. and put her cold feet against my legs, and how I had never once in 41 years felt anything other than completely certain that she was mine. I thought about what the test was actually telling me. It was telling me that my ex-wife had been unfaithful before she left. It was confirming what part of me had always suspected, that her leaving so quickly, so completely, with so little fight, was the behavior of someone who was already somewhere else entirely. It was telling me that a man somewhere had a biological daughter he'd never known, and that my daughter had a biological father she had never met. It was not telling me anything about who had held her when she had nightmares, who had sat in the hard plastic chairs of the school nurse's office when she sprained her ankle at recess, who had learned, badly and with considerable Googling, how to do her hair for the 6th grade dance, who had driven her to Columbus on a Tuesday night when she was 22, and her first serious relationship had ended, and she just needed to come home. I called my daughter's room from the lobby phone. She answered on the second ring, and before she could say anything, I said, "I read it." There was silence. Then I heard her breath catch. I said, "I need you to hear this clearly. Are you listening?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Nothing has changed. Not one single thing. Do you understand me?" She was crying before I finished the sentence. Not the good crying from the engagement call, but something older and more ragged, like something she'd been holding for a very long time had finally been allowed to come out. I stood in the lobby of a Cincinnati hotel on the morning after my daughter's wedding and listened to her cry. And I talked her through it the same way I had talked her through every hard thing since she was 3 years old. Steadily, patiently, without rushing her toward okay. When she finally came downstairs, she walked across the lobby and put her arms around me, and neither of us said anything for a while. My son-in-law stood a few feet back, watching. When my daughter finally stepped away and went to find tissues, he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I said, "That was a brave letter." He said, "She deserved to have someone in her corner for that moment." I said, "She already did, but thank you for making sure." Now, I want to be honest about what came next, because this is not a story that wraps up cleanly in a hotel lobby. The anger came later. It came on the drive home to Columbus, alone in my car, 3 hours of interstate with nothing to do but think. The full weight of it settled in somewhere around Dayton. My ex-wife had known. She had always known. She had left when my daughter was 3 years old, and she had never said a word. I had paid nothing in child support. I had full custody. But I had spent 40 years as the only parent of a child who was not biologically mine, and my ex-wife had watched that happen without ever correcting the record. More than that, I thought about the years she had been largely absent, the birthdays she had skipped, the graduation she had attended for 45 minutes and left early from, claiming a migraine. I had always attributed her distance to selfishness, to the particular type of person who finds sustained commitment difficult. But now I wondered if there had been something else layered underneath it. Guilt, maybe, or the simpler cowardice of someone who had made a choice and couldn't figure out how to undo it. I also thought about the biological father. Whoever he was, he had a daughter. My daughter. She had her dark eyes from somewhere, her long fingers, the particular way she tilts her head when she's thinking hard. He was out there, or he wasn't, and he didn't know. My daughter, to her enormous credit, had already thought about all of this more carefully than I had. When we talked properly, not in the hotel lobby but a few weeks later, at her kitchen table in Cincinnati with coffee and thyme, she told me that she had decided she wanted to find him. I said I thought that was right. She asked if I was afraid of what that would mean for us. I told her the truth. I said I had spent one long night, about a week after the wedding, lying awake imagining a version of events where she found her biological father and he was wonderful, and she loved him and I became somehow less essential. I had looked at that fear directly and decided it was not a fear worth honoring. I was not going to be the kind of man who made his daughter choose between expanding her life and protecting his feelings. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said, "That's what I thought you'd say. That's why I wasn't afraid to look." The search took about 4 months. Her biological father turned out to be a retired schoolteacher in western Pennsylvania, 68 years old, widowed, with 2 grown sons. He had dated my ex-wife briefly more than 40 years ago and had no idea she had been pregnant. When the genetic genealogy service matched them, and my daughter sent him a careful, measured message explaining who she was, he called her within 2 hours. She told me about that conversation with a particular expression on her face that I had not seen before, something between wonder and grief and relief all at once. She said he had cried. She said he had said, "I don't know what I did to deserve this, but I'm grateful for it." She met him in April at a diner halfway between Pittsburgh and Cincinnati. She brought her husband. She sent me a photo afterward, the 3 of them in a booth, her biological father with her same dark eyes and her same long fingers, all of them smiling. I printed that photo and put it on my refrigerator. People have asked me how I managed that. The honest answer is that I didn't manage it so much as choose it. Every day for a few months, I chose to be glad for her, instead of afraid for myself. Some days that was easier than others. There were mornings when I looked at that photo and felt a complicated thing that I can only describe as the particular loneliness of being replaced in a category you didn't know was replaceable. But those mornings passed. And most mornings I just felt glad that she had found something she hadn't known was missing. My ex-wife called me about 6 weeks after the wedding. I don't know how she found out. I suspect my daughter told her, which was my daughter's right, but she called me on a Tuesday afternoon and started the conversation with an apology that felt rehearsed and took about 3 minutes to get to the point. I let her finish. Then I said, "I'm not interested in your explanation." She said, "You deserve one." I said, "What I deserved was the truth 40 years ago. What I deserved was the chance to make an informed choice. What you're offering me now is a story that makes you feel better, and I don't need it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You raised her well." I said, "I know." I hung up. I won't claim that was a satisfying conversation. Satisfaction requires something being made right, and nothing she could say would make 40 years right. But there was something in it that felt true. The act of refusing the explanation, of declining to give her the absolution she was looking for. I had spent a lot of my life being steady and accommodating and conflict avoidant, and there was something clarifying about simply saying no. "This is not a debt I owe you. There is one more piece of this I need to tell." About 3 months after the wedding, my son-in-law called me on a Sunday morning. My daughter was at a yoga class. He said he wanted to tell me something that was his to tell, not hers. When he and my daughter had first found out about the DNA results, before the wedding, before the letter, they had spent several evenings discussing what to do with the information. One of the options they had considered was not telling me at all, just keeping it between them, letting me live out my life without ever knowing. He said, "I want you to know that was never an option I was willing to accept." I pushed back on that every time it came up. I asked him why it mattered to him so much. He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "Because she used to tell me stories about you, about how you always told her the truth, even when it was hard, about how you never pretended things were okay when they weren't. She said the reason she trusts people is because you were always straight with her." He paused. "It didn't seem right to decide that you didn't deserve the same thing." I didn't say anything for a while. Then I said, "You're a good man. I knew it when I met you." He said, "I had a good example. I don't think I'm telling this story because I did anything heroic. I held my daughter while she cried in a hotel lobby. I printed a photo of her with a stranger and put it on my refrigerator. I told my ex-wife no when she asked me to perform forgiveness. I didn't feel. These are not extraordinary things. But I'm 63 years old, and I have learned that the ordinary choices, the daily, quiet decisions about what to honor and what to let go, are the architecture of a life. My daughter didn't need a perfect father. She needed a consistent one, a present one, a man who showed up in the hard plastic chairs and the school parking lots and the late-night phone calls, and kept showing up without keeping score. She told me once, not long ago, that she had been afraid the DNA results would make me feel cheated. I thought about that for a long time. The truth is that, if anything, they made me feel more certain. Not about biology or blood or what a father is technically defined to be, but about what the last 40 years actually were. What they meant. What was built in them. I didn't lose anything when she handed me that envelope, not really. I found out that a choice I had made 40 years ago to love someone completely, without reservation, without a backup plan, had held. That the thing I had built was exactly as solid as it had felt from the inside. That's not nothing. That's everything I was ever trying to do. I keep coming back to one image. Not the DNA result, not the hotel breakfast table, not even my daughter's face when she came downstairs that morning. I keep coming back to Nathan, standing a few feet back in that lobby, giving us space, watching to make sure she was okay. A young man who had known a hard truth for 2 years and had spent that entire time thinking about how to protect the people he loved from the damage of it. That image stays with me because it tells me everything I need to know about what kind of people raise what kind of people. I raised Claire to be honest even when honesty was costly. I didn't do that by lecturing her. I did it by being that way myself, consistently, in the small moments she was watching without me knowing she was watching. And somewhere along the line she found a man who had absorbed the same thing from wherever he had learned it. The cause and effect there is not mystical. It is just the quiet, compounding work of character over time. That's what I think about when I think about consequences. Not punishment, not reward, just the simple fact that what you practice, you become, and what you become shapes everyone in your orbit. My ex-wife practiced avoidance. She practiced the small, daily choice to let someone else carry the weight of a truth that was hers to carry. And 40 years later, the weight was still there, and it had only gotten heavier. She called me to apologize, and I don't think she understood that the thing she was apologizing for wasn't the affair. It was the cowardice that followed it. The decades of silence. That is a long time to carry something that warped. I'm not telling this as a cautionary tale about her. I'm telling it because I recognize the temptation. There were moments in raising Claire alone, broke moments, exhausted moments, moments when the loneliness of single parenthood felt like something physical pressing on my chest, when the easier thing would have been to cut corners on the truth, to tell her things were fine when they weren't, to let her believe the world was simpler than it was. I didn't do that, not because I was noble, but because I had the intelligence to understand that children see through softened versions of reality, and what they learn from discovering the gap between what you told them and what was true is that you don't trust them. I never wanted Claire to feel untrusted. And the perseverance part, that's the part nobody talks about enough. It is not dramatic. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. It is just showing up year after year for the school plays and the homework and the bad days and the phone calls at midnight and the drives to Cincinnati when she just needed to come home. It is doing that without calculating what you're owed for it, without banking it as leverage. The perseverance of ordinary presence, compounded over decades, is the most underrated force in a person's life. What I know now, at 63, is that the envelope Nathan handed me didn't take anything. It only showed me what had already been built. And what had already been built was solid. That's not luck. That's 40 years of small, unglamorous choices made consistently in the direction of what was right. Claire knows that now. She knew it before the envelope. That's the whole point.